It all began on a bright Saturday morning when David stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, and looked proudly at his garden, a vibrant patch of earth filled with marigolds, roses, fresh basil, and rows of juicy tomatoes glistening under the sun, a place he had nurtured for months as his personal retreat from the stress of work and daily life, when suddenly two stern-looking men in neatly pressed suits marched up the driveway with clipboards in their hands and cold expressions on their faces, instantly killing the peaceful vibe. And before David could even say good morning, one of them announced that the Homeowners Association had issued a violation notice against him, claiming that his beautiful garden was not in harmony with the community aesthetic, and therefore he would face a heavy fine unless he removed every plant within a week, leaving David completely stunned because he had carefully followed every guideline in the HOA manual and his garden was well kept, neat, and admired by several of his neighbors. Yet here were these board members acting as if he had committed some crime by planting flowers and vegetables on his own property, and as David listened to them lecture him with arrogance about bylaws and regulations, he felt a mix of anger and disbelief rising inside him, especially when one of the men smirked and said that the HOA could take further legal action if he refused to comply, words that turned what should have been a peaceful Saturday into a storm of frustration, because in David's eyes his garden symbolized freedom, hard work, and beauty, not a violation or an offense. And while the board members scribbled on their clipboards, taking pictures of his flower beds as if they were evidence of a crime scene, David's thoughts raced, wondering why the HOA had suddenly targeted him when other neighbors had lawn ornaments, trimmed hedges, and even backyard playsets that technically went against the same so-called aesthetic rules, but none of them were receiving notices or threats, which made him realize that this was not about community standards at all but about control, power, and perhaps even personal grudges. And as he stood there gripping his coffee mug, his mind replayed all the effort he had put into this small paradise, digging the soil, planting seeds, watering every evening after work, watching each sprout turn into something beautiful, only to have someone from the wall label it as a problem. And he felt a knot tighten in his chest as anger mixed with determination, because deep down he knew he could not simply bow down and tear everything apart, not when his garden was both legal and loved by many of his neighbors. Yet in that moment, with the HOA officials walking away and leaving the violation notice on his porch like a scarlet letter, David stood frozen, staring at the paper, his mind filled with questions, doubts, and a burning sense of injustice that he knew he would have to confront, setting the stage for a battle he never imagined he would have to fight against the very people who were supposed to support and protect the neighborhood community. David stood there for a long moment after the HOA members left, the violation notice trembling slightly in his hand as the morning breeze rustled the leaves in his garden, and while frustration filled his chest, a quiet determination began to grow, because deep inside he knew that giving up would mean letting injustice win. So instead of tearing down his hard work, he spent the next several evenings researching the HOA bylaws, going through every page with a highlighter, marking every clause about landscaping and community aesthetics, and to his surprise he discovered that nowhere did it say vegetables were forbidden, and in fact the rules only required homeowners to maintain cleanliness and avoid clutter, both of which his garden already fulfilled. And that discovery gave him strength, so he decided to reach out to his neighbors, walking door to door to ask what they thought of his garden, and nearly every person he spoke to praised it, some even mentioning how they enjoyed the fresh look it gave the street compared to dull, empty lawns, and a few even admitted they wished they had the time to plant their own flowers but loved seeing his every day, which gave David the idea to collect written support. So he asked neighbors to sign a simple statement saying they had no problem with his garden, and within 2 days he had a small stack of signatures in his hand, proof that this was not just his fight but something the community quietly supported. Yet he knew the HOA would not give up easily, and sure enough, a week later, they called him into a formal hearing where board members sat around a long table with stern faces, holding folders and photographs of his yard as if it were some kind of courtroom trial. And as he walked into that room with his documents, his notes, and the signatures of his neighbors, he felt nervous but also ready, because this time he would not just listen, he would fight back. So when they accused him again of violating community aesthetics, he calmly laid out the highlighted sections of the bylaws, showing clearly that his garden was within every rule, and then he presented the signatures from neighbors, pointing out that community harmony was clearly intact, and finally he held up a letter from a local gardening association he had contacted online that confirmed vegetable gardens were often encouraged in suburban areas for sustainability, which made the HOA's argument look weak and unreasonable. and for the first time he saw their confident expressions flicker, some of them whispering to each other, realizing he had built a case stronger than their intimidation tactics, and though they tried to push back, suggesting they had the final say on appearances, David boldly reminded them that their authority came from the bylaws and the will of the community, not personal opinions, which made several neighbors in the audience nod in agreement, because word of the hearing had spread and a handful had come to watch, and their presence gave David even more courage, so he spoke louder, declaring that the law could not misuse power to harass homeowners for personal bias, and the room grew tense as silence hung for a moment before one of the board members reluctantly admitted that the wording of the bylaws did not explicitly forbid gardens like his, a statement that practically sealed the victory, though they refused to apologize and ended the meeting with a vague promise to review the rules. David walked out with his head held high, his garden safe and his spirit stronger than ever, and when he returned home that evening he found a group of neighbors waiting near his driveway with smiles, some clapping and congratulating him, and one elderly woman even handed him a small basket of cookies saying, "You stood up for all of us," words that made his chest swell with pride because he realized this battle had not just been about flowers and vegetables but about fairness and courage, and in the days that followed, his garden seemed to shine brighter under the sun, a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to bow down to unfair authority, and though the wall remained watchful, their power had been checked, their intimidation shaken, and eventually they quietly dropped the matter because they knew pushing further would only backfire, leaving David not only victorious but respected across the neighborhood, and as he watered his plants one evening, watching the golden light of sunset paint the sky, he reflected on the entire ordeal and understood the moral that sometimes standing firm against injustice requires patience, preparation, and courage, but when you do, not only do you protect what you love, you also inspire others to see that rules should serve the community, not control it, and in that moment David realized his garden had given him more than beauty and peace. It had given him strength, a story worth telling, and a lesson worth remembering. Never be afraid to fight for what is right, because even the smallest voice backed by truth can silence the loudest power fueled by arrogance.